Game of Thrones ended in May 2019, and for a show that had spent 8 years making people lose their minds over plot twists and character deaths, and the constant, ruthless suggestion that nobody in this world was ever really safe, the ending was complicated. That is being polite about it. Some people really did not like it. The internet had some thoughts. But here is the thing about Game of Thrones that tends to get a bit lost in all the discourse about the final season. The world it built is still one of the densest, most carefully constructed fictional universes that has ever been put on television. Across 8 seasons and 73 episodes, it accumulated a long list of questions that it either answered incompletely or gestured at without fully committing to an answer, all left open in the particular way that a world with this much mythology underneath it tends to leave things open. There is a lot there, more than most shows, and the questions that remain are, in a lot of cases, more interesting than the ones it did resolve. All of this is what tonight is for. The arguments about whether the ending was earned. Those will keep running on their own, probably for as long as people care about the show, which seems like quite a long time. What we are doing here is something quieter. We are going through the things the show built carefully, and then chose not to close. The places where it looked at a question and decided, for one reason or another, that leaving it open was the better move. There is a particular texture to Game of Thrones' mysteries that is worth naming before we go anywhere. The show is set in a world that has roughly 12,000 years of documented history, most of which the show never visits, and none of which the characters have clean access to. What happened 8,000 years ago is legend. What happened 3,000 years ago is a mix of legend and fragmentary record. What happened 300 years ago is history, taught in academies and recorded by meisters. But even that history contains gaps and contradictions. The closer you get to the show's present, the more reliable the record, but the present itself is being written by people with competing interests, and nobody has a complete picture of what is happening even as it happens. This means the mysteries in Game of Thrones exist at different levels of unknowability. Some things are unknown because they happened too long ago for anyone to have documented them. Some are unknown because the people who knew have died. Some are unknown because the people who know have chosen not to say. And some are unknown because the world itself does not have an explanation, because no one inside the narrative has a clean explanation for it. Knowing which category a given mystery belongs to is part of what makes this world interesting to think about. We're going to cover things from all of those categories tonight. Some of what we discuss is very old. Questions about the Night King and the children of the forest that predate human civilization in Westeros by thousands of years. Some is more recent but deliberately obscured. Things characters know and have chosen not to share. Some is current but structurally unclear. Things that happened on screen that the show chose not to explain even though it could have. All of it is interesting, and none of it is going anywhere. Some of what we are going to walk through tonight was left open deliberately. The show made a choice to not explain something, and I think that was often the right call. There is a specific kind of mystery that works better as a mystery than it would as an explanation. The Night King is the most obvious example of this, and we will get there. But there is something about a threat that cannot be fully accounted for, that carries a different kind of weight than one that can be. Some of what we will cover was probably going to be answered in books that do not exist yet. George R.R. Martin has been writing the 6th book in A Song of Ice and Fire, The Winds of Winter, for quite some time now. A Dream of Spring, the 7th and final novel, has no published draft. The show overtook the source material after roughly season 5 and had to navigate toward an ending using Martin's broad outline but without his finished text. So some of these mysteries might someday be answered on a page. Some might not. The books are famously slow to arrive, and making predictions about when feels unwise. And then there is a third category, which is the mysteries that exist simply because a world this complicated cannot fully account for itself. The further back you go in Westerosi history, the thinner the record and the larger the gaps. There are civilizations in this universe that rose and fell thousands of years before anyone built the wall, or named a Stark, or sat on the Iron Throne. There are corners of Essos that nobody on the show ever visited. There are things in the margins of this world that the story never needed to address in order to work, and which are therefore more interesting for having never been addressed. The mystery is the texture of the world feeling larger than anyone telling of it. If you're hoping for a definitive answer tonight on where Drogon flew after melting the Iron Throne, or what the Night King truly wanted, or who Azor Ahai really was, I cannot give you one. Nobody can, really. What I can do is walk through what the show actually gave us, lay out the evidence alongside the questions it raises, and let the mysteries be what they are. Comfortable company for a long night. We have got about 2 hours of material here, and the intention is very much that you can fall asleep at any point without feeling like you have missed a crucial resolution. There is no payoff coming, no big reveal, just a long, unhurried tour of a fictional world that is very good at feeling real, including the parts where the real history of most places is mostly questions with approximate answers. If you are new here, and this sounds like the sort of thing you would like more of, long-form lore content designed for falling asleep to, subscribing would be a lovely thing to do. But there is no urgency. Nothing about what we are doing tonight requires urgency. There is something worth saying about scale before we get into any of this. The history of Westeros stretches back roughly 12,000 years before the events of the show, before the Wall, before House Stark, before the Iron Throne existed as a concept. The children of the forest were living in the forests of Westeros when the first men crossed from Essos across what is now the Stepstones, probably around 12,000 years before Ned Stark rode south to become Robert's Hand of the King. The wars between the children and the first men lasted for centuries. The pact that ended those wars lasted for thousands of years after that. The long night, the catastrophic supernatural winter that the White Walkers brought. The event that everything in the show's mythology is ultimately downstream of, happened 8,000 years before Season 1. That is an enormous amount of time. That is longer than recorded human history in the real world, by a significant margin. What that means for the mysteries we are going to discuss is that they are old. Not just old in the way that ancient history is old, but vast in a way that makes the show's events, 8 seasons, roughly 300 years of documented Westerosi history, covered in the background. The specific events of about 305 years after the conquest feel like a very small slice of something much larger. The questions the show raises tend to have roots that go back further than any explanation the show was positioned to give. George R.R. Martin built this deliberately. He has spoken in interviews about wanting to create a world that felt inhabited in the sense that real places feel inhabited, full of history that exceeds anyone telling of it, with things happening beyond the edges of the story you are focusing on, with causes that predate the narrative and consequences that extend past where the narrative ends. Whether the show fully delivered on that ambition in its final seasons is a conversation with a lot of opinions attached to it. What the world building achieved, even in places where the plotting stumbled, is something unusual for television. A few things to orient you as we go. The show ran for 8 seasons between 2011 and 2019. It was based on A Song of Ice and Fire, a novel series by George R.R. Martin, of which 5 books have been published. The 6th, The Winds of Winter, remains unfinished. The show overtook the books sometime around Season 5, after which Benioff and Weiss were working from Martin's broad outlines rather than finished source material. Some of what feels incomplete or unresolved in the show may be things Martin intends to address in the remaining books. Some of it may simply be the cost of adapting a story whose ending has not yet been written. The world of the show is also bigger than Westeros. There is Essos to the east, a continent vastly larger than Westeros, with civilizations and histories and supernatural phenomena of its own that the show visited occasionally but never explored properly. There is Sothoryos to the south, a mostly unexplored continent of jungles and ruins. There is whatever is west of Westeros across the Sunset Sea, which Arya sails toward at the end of the show, and which no one in the known world has ever documented. The show gestures at all of this. It never goes there. What we know about the mysteries we are going to cover tonight comes from what the show did show us: episodes, dialogue, the occasional exposition from a character who knew more than most, and what people have put together from close watching over the years since it ended. The GOT fandom is thorough and attentive, and has had 6 years to review the footage. The gaps that remain are real gaps, not things that can be solved by re-watching episode 4 of season 6. So, let us begin, right then. Let us start where the mystery is oldest and strangest, north of the Wall, with a being who had been waiting for thousands of years before Ned Stark ever rode south for King's Landing. There is a moment in the Battle of Winterfell, Season 8, Episode 3, where the Night King arrives at the castle on the back of the resurrected dragon Viserion and does something that, if you are paying attention to it, is actually the most revealing thing he does in the entire episode. He does not engage with the battle. He does not direct his forces against the walls or lead his White Walkers in some strategic push against the defenders. He simply walks through the carnage toward the Godswood, where Bran Stark is waiting by a weirwood tree. The battle is happening around him. Thousands of Whites are dying. Arya Stark is fighting for her life in the library. Daenerys and Jon are on their dragons above the clouds, and the Night King is walking through all of it purposefully toward one specific target, as if the battle was always just noise, because for him it probably was. That is the mystery of the Night King in miniature. Not what he was doing. He was going to kill Bran, but why? What is the actual end state he's working toward? And why is the living archive of human memory the single most important thing he needs to destroy in order to reach it? The show answers this question briefly and then moves on. Bran explains it to the assembled defenders before the battle. The Night King wants to erase all living memory of the world of men. He has been trying to kill the three-eyed raven before, multiple times. Destroying Bran is not incidental to his campaign, it is the campaign. Everything else is infrastructure. But this explanation, satisfying as far as it goes, immediately raises a second question. If erasing human memory is the goal, and if the three-eyed raven is what stands between the Night King and that goal, why did he wait 8,000 years? Why raise a massive army? Why spend thousands of years accumulating forces north of the Wall when the previous three-eyed ravens were presumably alive and accessible in those centuries too? I do not have a clean answer for this, and I am not sure the show does either. The most charitable reading is that the Night King was waiting for specific conditions. The wall still standing, no way to breach it without a weapon powerful enough to bring it down, and no weapon like that available until Daenerys flew 3 dragons to Westeros. In this reading, everything about his timing makes sense. He waited until the army of the living brought him the tool he needed and then walked it into a trap beyond the wall. He had a spear ready. He was patient in the way that something very old and very certain of its eventual victory tends to be patient. But the show does not articulate this. It shows it in the sense that attentive watching can build the inference, but it never states it. Which is fine, actually. The Night King, without a monologue explaining his strategic thinking, is more interesting than one who sits down and lays it all out. Now, the origin. The children of the forest created the first White Walker, and this was shown properly in Season 6. They were at war with the First Men, who were cutting down their sacred weirwood trees and destroying the forests the children depended on. Desperate, they took a human man, bound him to a weirwood tree, and pushed a shard of dragonglass into his heart. His eyes turned blue. He became what the Night King eventually was. The children built a weapon to use against the first men. The weapon worked. And then at some point that the show does not specify, the weapon stopped being a weapon and started being something else. Something that did not distinguish between the people who made it and the people it was made against. Something with its own purpose, its own agenda, its own ancient patient hatred for living things in general. Whether the children knew this would happen, or whether the Night King's independence was a surprise to them, is another thing the show never clarifies. When Leaf, one of the last surviving children, confirms to Bran that they created him, she says simply that they were desperate and at war. She does not explain what went wrong, or when, or why a weapon built to kill the first men ended up killing everyone. One of the show's most visually prominent unanswered questions is the spiral symbol. Throughout the series, the White Walkers left arrangements of body parts, human and animal, in precise spiral or pinwheel patterns at their kill sites. These patterns appeared as early as the prologue of the very first episode. They appeared at the Fist of the First Men massacre. The Children of the Forest's cave was decorated with the same spiral motif carved into stone. The show never explains what these symbols mean, whether they are ritual, communication, a record of territory, a religious observance. Nobody says. The implication feels significant. An entity that arranges its victims into specific patterns is not mindless. It is doing something. What that something is remains open. And then there is the question of the White Walkers themselves as a population, which deserves its own section. But briefly here, the Night King was not alone. He had lieutenants, senior White Walkers who moved with individual purpose and who shattered into ice when he died. They were not interchangeable. They had hierarchy. Whatever the Night King was building north of the wall, across those 8,000 years of silence, it had structure. The Night King himself died the way the show wanted him to die, suddenly poetically, at the hands of the least expected person. Arya Stark, who had trained with the Faceless Men in Biara Vose, who had been told by Mel Sahandru that she would close many eyes, brown, green and blue, drove the cat's paw dagger into his chest in the Godswood. He shattered. Every White Walker shattered. Every white fell. The dagger, incidentally, is the same Valyrian steel blade that was used in the assassination attempt on Bran in Season 1, the very event that set most of the show's events in motion. It passed through several hands, Littlefinger had it, then it came to Bran, who gave it to Arya, and it ended up being the weapon that killed the Night King, which has a certain elegance to it, even if it was never fully unpacked. His story ended without the show explaining what he experienced across those thousands of years. Whether there is something it is like to be an entity of this kind, built from a human who was transformed against his will into a force for destruction, is not a question the show was interested in asking. Possibly because the answer would diminish what he represented. A force without psychology is more unsettling than one you can fully understand. He was the end of all things, and the show trusted the mystery of that more than any explanation could have been trusted. There is one more thing about the Night King that I find myself returning to, which is the question of recognition. He and Bran had a specific encounter in Season 6, when Bran unwisely warged into the weirwood tree without supervision and walked through the army of the dead in a vision. He moved through the whites invisibly, the way Bran tends to move through his visions, an observer who cannot be perceived. Then he came to the Night King, standing in the middle of his army, and the Night King turned and looked directly at him, grabbed his arm physically in the vision, left a mark that persisted into the waking world. The Night King could see Bran, could grab him through the vision, could track him by the mark across any distance after that moment. Of everything the show told us about what the Night King was, this is the detail I find most interesting. Not the army or the dragon or the ice spears. The fact that he could perceive the three-eyed raven in a vision, and that he grabbed him and that the grab left a physical mark. It suggests a specific, particular awareness of Bran. Not just knowledge that the three-eyed raven existed, but an active, directed attention. As if the Night King had been waiting for Bran specifically, or for whoever the three-eyed raven was at this moment in history, and the encounter in the vision was the two of them seeing each other clearly for the first time. What that recognition felt like from the Night King's side, whether he experienced anything like satisfaction or urgency or ancient hatred, is not something the show ever shows us. He is always still. He is always patient. He is always moving toward the same destination. But the moment in the vision has a quality to it that feels like more than strategic identification of a target. It feels like something older than strategy. The Viserion episode is worth a moment too. The Beyond the Wall expedition in Season 7, the one where Jon and a small group of named characters went to capture a wight to bring south as proof, resulted in Du Nea ISS flying north to rescue them, the Night King throwing an ice spear at Viserion, and Viserion dying and being reanimated as an undead dragon. That sequence is the thing that allowed the Night King to breach the wall at the end of Season 7. The question is whether the Night King anticipated this specifically. He had an ice spear ready. Ice spears large enough to kill a dragon are not standard equipment. They seem purpose-built, or at least they seem to have been made in advance of the opportunity arising. Did the Night King know that Du Nea ISS would come north with her dragons? Did he know that one of them could be brought down with the right throw at the right moment? Did he allow Jon's group to assemble and travel north specifically because he knew it would draw the dragons to him? The show does not answer this. But the fact that he threw the spear on the first opportunity, and it worked, and that the result was exactly what he needed to breach the wall, creates the nagging impression that the whole thing was managed. That the Night King was not reacting to the Beyond the Wall expedition, but waiting for it. And then Arya killed him, and he shattered, and that was the end of it. Whatever he was thinking about Bran, whatever 8,000 years of patient waiting had felt like, from the inside, concluded in one moment in a godswood, with a girl dropping a dagger from one hand to the other. The Night King had lieutenants. This is easy to overlook in the chaos of the final season, but it is one of the most interesting details in the whole mythology of the show. Senior White Walkers who moved with intelligence and purpose, who flanked him in organised formations, who appeared to have rank and individual characteristics. When the Night King died, and they all shattered in the same moment, the question left behind is not just what he was, but what they were. What exactly had been living in the land of always winter for the last 8,000 years? The answer the show gives is very partial. The most specific information about White Walker creation comes from the Craster subplot, which ran quietly through the early seasons and then paid off properly in Season 4. Craster was a wildling who lived beyond the wall in deliberate isolation. He had an arrangement with the White Walkers. He gave them his infant sons. Not killed, left in the snow, in specific locations, on specific nights. The White Walkers collected the babies. The Night King was shown doing the collection himself in Season 4. He took an infant from one of the show's primary antagonists, a White Walker who had been receiving the babies, and he touched the child's cheek. The baby's eyes turned blue. It became, the implication is clear, a White Walker, not a white, not mindless undead, but something with the intelligence and purpose of the beings who had already existed for thousands of years. This raises a question that the show plants clearly, and then does not answer. What happens to the babies between conversion and adulthood? How does a White Walker grow from an infant to the tall, pale, silent figures we see throughout the series? What does that development look like? Does a White Walker experience anything in those years? Does the person who was that baby persist in any form inside what they became? I do not know, and I find that I think about it sometimes. There is something about the specific detail of the babies, the care with which they were collected, the individual attention from the Night King himself, that suggests this mattered. It was not just replenishment of troops, it was something more particular than that. The White Walkers, it is worth saying, are not wights. Wights are the dead animated by the Night King's power. They are bodies with motion, but no apparent individual will. White Walkers are something different. They use weapons. They make strategic decisions. They communicate, apparently, though the show never showed us how. The dialogue in Season 4 mentioned that the White Walkers have their own language. We never heard it, not once across the entire series, an entire language that was built into the show's lore and existed entirely off-screen. There is a hierarchy too, the Night King at the top, then a tier of White Walker generals who moved with individual purpose and made individual decisions. The show does not clarify how this hierarchy was established or what role each general played. Did they have specializations, territories, responsibilities? 8,000 years of organized existence suggests something more than a mob, but the show never shows you the interior of what they built. The land of always winter, the northern polar region, unmapped, never visited by anyone in the show, is where they have lived since the long night. Nobody went there. Nobody could. Whatever it looks like, whatever structures or patterns or culture the White Walkers established across those 8,000 years of absence exists entirely in the imagination of whoever is watching. The spiral patterns they left at murder sites are the only evidence we have of their aesthetic or ritual life. The same pattern that appeared in the cave of the children of the forest, carved centuries earlier. Whether this means the White Walkers and the children shared some cultural inheritance from the moment of the former's creation, or whether the pattern carries a different meaning to each of them, is another of those questions that the show places in front of you, and then walks away from. One of the most interesting things about the White Walkers as a storytelling choice is the decision to make them fundamentally alien. They do not speak on screen. They do not explain themselves. They do not have desires in any human sense, or at least none that they communicate. The show chose this. It would have been easy to give a White Walker a monologue, to have one captured and interrogated, to have Bran peer into their history the way he peered into everyone else's. None of that happened. The result is that the White Walkers remain the show's most purely mysterious element. More mysterious than the Lord of Light, more mysterious than the prophecies, more mysterious even than the Night King. Because the Night King at least had a goal that could be stated, the White Walkers had a culture that was never even named. When the Night King died and they all shattered, what was lost was not just an army. It was an entire civilization that the show built the silhouette of and then never filled in. Which is a strange thing to say about a story's antagonists, but Game of Thrones is a show that was always more interested in the human political consequences of the supernatural threat than in the threat itself. The Night King is ultimately a plot mechanism for the human story. The White Walkers are furniture, and that might be a deliberate choice, or it might be a limitation, and I am not sure it matters which, because the result is the same either way. 8,000 years of alien civilization in permanent darkness that nobody ever documented. Let me say one more thing about the Craster arrangement specifically, because it is strange in a way that has always stuck with me, and that I have never heard a fully satisfying explanation for. Craster kept the arrangement secret from most of the Night's Watch, but the senior officers of the Watch knew about it and tolerated it. They needed Craster's compound as a stopping point beyond the wall. They looked away from what he was doing with his sons. This is mentioned briefly and then dropped. The moral cost of the accommodation, the question of what the Night's Watch had become in the long centuries since anyone had actually seen a White Walker. But the more interesting question is why Craster specifically? The White Walkers could have simply taken any human infant they found beyond the wall. There were wildlings living out there, free folk settlements scattered across the lands north of the wall. They did not, as far as we know, systematically raid wildling camps for babies. They had an arrangement with one specific man who voluntarily gave his sons and who received something in return. Specifically, the White Walkers left him alone. His compound was safe. They never came for him or the women in his keeping. This suggests the White Walkers were capable of making agreements with humans when those agreements served their purposes. It suggests they could identify a willing participant, communicate the terms of an arrangement across a barrier of language and biology, and honour that arrangement across decades. Craster had been keeping his deal for a very long time before the events of the show. He had given dozens of sons by his own account. What does that imply about White Walker society? That they have trade relationships? That they can distinguish between humans who serve them and humans who do not? That the arrangement was personal? Something between Craster and an individual White Walker, or the Night King himself? The show raises all of this and answers none of it. Craster died in the mutiny at his compound in Season 3, taking whatever he knew about the arrangement with him. The babies are the most open question of all. We know what happened the moment the Night King touched one. We do not know anything that came after. One of the things that gets quietly lost in the discussion of the White Walkers is the sheer organisational scale of what the Night King assembled. He had hundreds of thousands of whites by the time of the Battle of Winterfell. Giants, at least one undead dragon by the end. An army that moved as a coordinated unit rather than a mob, that could be directed, that responded to the Night King's intentions across enormous distances. Coordinating an army of that size requires communication infrastructure of some kind. Commands need to be relayed. Units need to know where to move. The Night King appeared to control the whites directly through his own will. When he raised his arms on the battlefield, the whites he was looking at rose, but he cannot have been individually directing every action of hundreds of thousands of animated corpses simultaneously. There is something else at work, some distributed system of control that the show implies without explaining. This connects to the broader question of whether the White Walkers and their white army are a single organism in some sense, the Night King as the central will, the White Walkers as extended agents of that will, the whites as peripheral limbs. When the Night King died, every White Walker and every white fell simultaneously. The simultaneity is significant. It was not an army losing its general and continuing to fight. It was a single system losing its core and shutting down entirely. If that is what the White Walkers were, a distributed system with the Night King as the processing centre, then the question of what the individual White Walkers experienced becomes very strange. Were they autonomous? Did they have separate perspectives? Or were they something closer to extensions of a single will that had long since subsumed whatever individual identities they had as converted humans? The show raises this implicitly in the simultaneous death scene and never addresses it at all. The White Walkers as a civilization and the White Walkers as a biological system are not necessarily in contradiction, but understanding which one they were, or whether the distinction even applies to something this old and this different from human existence, is the question the show was never interested in answering. There is a line in the Game of Thrones finale that I have thought about more than probably any other single line in the series. It is delivered quietly, almost as an aside, during the Dragon Pit Council scene, where the surviving lords of Westeros are deciding who should rule the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion makes his case that Bran Stark should be king, partly because he is the living memory of the world, partly because he cannot sire heirs and therefore cannot found a dynasty, partly because Tyrion has run out of other ideas. He turns to Bran and asks if he will accept the crown, and Bran says, "Why do you think I came all this way?" Not yes, and not, "I did not expect this, but I accept." Not even, "I suppose so." Why do you think I came all this way? As if the entire journey the tower fall, the years beyond the wall, the cave of the three-eyed raven, the cave attack, the loss of Hodor, the long trip back south, was always leading to this specific moment, and he knew it. That line, delivered in that quiet, almost amused tone, is either the show confirming that Bran has been seeing the future and steering toward it, or it is a piece of characterization that suggests he has accepted whatever the three-eyed raven's knowledge has shown him about where he was going. The show does not clarify which, it just lets the line sit there. Let us back up a bit and talk about what Bran actually became. He fell from the tower in Winterfell in the first episode, pushed by Jaime Lan Ice Tear to hide the secret of the Lan Oyster twins. The fall should have killed him. It left him paralysed from the waist down, and it started a years-long process that ended with him becoming the Three-Eyed Raven, a title and a role rather than a person, the living repository of all human memory going back thousands of years. The previous Three-Eyed Raven, a man named Brynden Rivers, who had been sitting in a cave beyond the wall for centuries with tree roots growing through his body, told Bran before he died that he was not ready. Then Bran had to become the Three-Eyed Raven anyway, immediately, because the Night King was attacking the cave, and everything was on fire. Not exactly a graceful transition. Meera Reed, who had spent years carrying Bran, protecting him, watching her brother die for him, came to say goodbye in Season 7 and told Bran that everything he had gone through had cost them both enormously. Bran's response was essentially detached acknowledgement. He said he was not really Bran Stark anymore. He remembered the events of Bran Stark's life, the way you remember something that happened to someone else. The emotional weight of it had receded. Meera left crying. Bran watched her go with serene blankness. That scene is sort of devastating if you let it be. Now, the Hodor question. Hodor, whose real name was Wyles, was a young stable boy at Winterfell who at some point in his childhood had a seizure, repeated the word "hold the door" in some kind of traumatic episode, and was left permanently affected by it, capable of saying only the one word, Hodor, which he said constantly and which nobody around him understood as anything other than a personal quirk or a mild developmental difference. In Season 6, during the attack on the Three-Eyed Raven's cave, Bran was in a vision of Winterfell's past while simultaneously warging into present Hodor to make him carry Bran's body toward the exit. The trauma of being warged into, while also being psychically connected to a vision of young Wylis in the past, shattered something in Wylis's mind. It turned him into Hodor at that moment, during that vision, decades before the event in the cave. What happened to Wylis in the past was caused by what Bran did in the present. This is a closed time loop. Bran did not change history. He was always part of it. The trauma that made Hodor who he was always had a cause, and that cause was always Bran. The word Hodor was always a corrupted version of hold the door, a command from a moment that had not happened yet, at the time it affected Wylis. The implication of this is enormous, and the show mostly does not engage with it directly. If Bran's actions in the present can cause events in the past, and if those events are fixed rather than changeable, then Bran is potentially woven into the fabric of Westerosi history in ways we cannot see. How many other things that happened in the show's 8,000-year backstory are closed loops involving Bran? The show's answer is, we do not know, and we are not going to tell you. What we do know is that Bran demonstrated knowledge of things he could not have known through normal means on multiple occasions. The most striking example is in Season 7 when Littlefinger visited Bran in Winterfell's Godswood and said something manipulative about chaos, standard Littlefinger. Bran looked at him and repeated back, word for word, a private conversation Littlefinger had held with Varys in King's Landing years earlier, a conversation Bran was not physically present for and had no normal way of knowing. Chaos is a ladder, he said. Littlefinger went pale and left. Bran told Sansa he could see many things. He was deliberately vague about the extent and accuracy of his foresight. He said he could see some things that had not happened yet, but whether he sees all possible futures or only some, and whether what he sees is certain or merely probable, is never clarified. Which brings us back to the question that the finale raises, but does not answer. Did Bran engineer the events of the final season? Did he know that Daenerys was going to burn King's Landing? That Jon was going to have to kill her? That the political aftermath would create a moment where an elective monarchy was the obvious solution and he was the obvious candidate? And did he, knowing this, allow those events to unfold rather than intervening? The show gives you the behaviour, but not the confession. Bran in Season 8 is serene in a way that looks, from the outside, like acceptance of something inevitable. He does not seem surprised by Daenerys' turn. He does not seem distressed by Jon's choice. He shows up to the Dragon Pit Council and accepts the crown with an expression that suggests he already knew this was where he was going. "Why do you think I came all this way?" He ended the series trying to find Drogon with his warging abilities. Whether he succeeded is not shown. His first act as king was to send someone to look for a dragon, which is either the most three-eyed raven thing a king has ever done, already seeing 12 moves ahead and positioning for something the rest of the council cannot perceive, or it is just a loose thread. The show does not say which. There is another dimension to the Bran question that does not get discussed enough, which is the question of what it means to govern when you can see everything. Tyr Eon's argument for Bran as king rests partly on the fact that he is the world's memory. He knows all of Westeros' history. He has access to the record of every mistake and every consequence. And a ruler with that knowledge theoretically could not be fooled or manipulated in the ways that previous rulers were. He cannot be lied to about historical precedents because he knows the actual history. He cannot be manipulated with false information because he has access to what actually happened. That is a reasonable argument on paper, but it assumes Bran uses that knowledge, that he is engaged with the present in the way a ruler needs to be engaged. And what the show consistently showed us about Bran as the three-eyed raven is that he was not particularly engaged with the present. He sat in his wheelchair at the margins of scenes. He watched. He answered questions when directly asked and said unsettling things that revealed his access to information nobody else had. He did not initiate. He did not warn people about things that were coming. He did not intervene. He knew about the assassination attempt on him in the very first episode, the cat's paw dagger, Littlefinger's involvement, the long chain of conspiracy that stretched from that moment to everything that followed. He knew because he had lived through it, and he had the three-eyed raven's access to the past. He gave the dagger to Arya without comment. He did not explain to Sansa what he knew about how the Stark family's downfall had been engineered. He let things happen. Whether that is wisdom, the understanding that some things need to happen for the world to reach the place it needs to reach, or whether it is the three-eyed raven's fundamental detachment from human concerns translated into something that looks like passivity, is one of those questions the show does not settle. There is also the matter of what Bran's governance actually looks like day to day. The show ends with him at a small council meeting that is mostly played for light comedy. Sam pitching historical ideas, Brienne taking minutes, Bronn complaining about brothels. It is charming. It does not give you any real sense of what it is like to govern a kingdom under an all-seeing king. What happens when Bran walks into a raven and observes a lord committing a crime in their private hall? What happens when he knows what a petitioner is planning to say before they say it? What are the politics of living under a ruler who knows things he should not know and whose information network is literally the entire animal kingdom? The show had no appetite for these questions, and I understand why. The final season had an enormous amount of material to cover. But they sit there, interesting and uninvestigated, which is sort of the story of Bran as a character in general. Before we get to the candidates, let us talk about what the prophecy actually says. because it is actually worth examining as a piece of in-world mythology, and it deserves more than being summarized as the Chosen One. Azor Ahai was an ancient hero who lived during the First Long Night. Roughly 8,000 years before the events of the show, he forged a legendary sword called Lightbringer. The forging required 3 attempts. The first 2 failed. The third involved plunging the blade into the chest of his wife, Nissa, while she was still alive. Her soul passed into the sword, and Lightbringer became a weapon of fire that drove back the darkness. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The founding myth of the religion of the Lord of Light, the faith that Mel, Isan, Dru and Kinvara and the Red Priests across Essos serve, involves a man destroying the person he loved most to create the weapon that saved the world. The sacrifice at the centre of it is intimate and terrible. Not war, not heroism, but a private act of grief performed in the dark. The prophecy states that Azor Ahai will be reborn, born amidst salt and smoke, and rising again to wield Lightbringer against the darkness. The High Valyrian word for the prophesied hero, as Missandei helpfully pointed out to Du Nair ESS in Season 7, is gender neutral. Prince or princess, either could be the subject. Now the candidates, Stannis Bu Rath Eun was Meli Sahan Dru's first and most confident choice. She was completely certain. She brought him a sword, she performed ceremonies, she burned people in his name. She was wrong. He burned his daughter Shireen, a horrific scene, and one of the show's most significant moral turning points, and then died in the snow outside Winterfell, having lost nearly everything. Melisandre Dru survived him, and eventually admitted the mistake with a kind of quiet devastation that made her character much more interesting than her earlier certainty had. Jon Snow fits almost every stated condition. He was born in unusual circumstances at the Tower of Joy in Dorne, where a battle had just been fought, where his mother, Lyanna Stark, died after childbirth. Salt and smoke could be metaphorical. He was resurrected, which is a kind of second birth. He fought the White Walkers directly and survived. He eventually killed the person he loved most to prevent her from destroying the world. If you are going to pick a candidate who fits the structural shape of the Azor Ahai legend, including the sacrifice of the beloved, Jon is the one. Du Nair Is also fits several conditions. She was literally born during a storm on the island of Dragonstone, amidst thunder and, depending on how you read the geography of a volcanic island, something that could be argued as smoke. She brought dragons back from extinction. She liberated cities. She crossed a sea to reclaim a continent. Then she burned a city. And then there is Arya, who is not anyone's prophecy candidate, who has no connection to the Lord of Light religion, and who actually killed the Night King. The prophecy's stated goal, the defeat of the darkness, was achieved by Arya Stark with a Valyrian steel dagger in a godswood. Not by a chosen hero wielding Lightbringer, by a young woman who had trained in a completely different tradition entirely, and who arrived from behind at exactly the right moment. Mel Isan Dru looked at Arya before the battle and reminded her of something she had said when they first met, years earlier. "I see a darkness in you, and in that darkness, eyes staring back at me. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, eyes you'll shut forever." Brown and green had been the Walder Freyers and the Lan Aester soldiers Arya had already killed. Blue eyes were White Walkers. It sounds in retrospect like a prophecy, like Melisandre Dru knew, or the Lord of Light knew, and the whole thing was always pointing at Arya, except none of that was stated clearly at the time. Mel, Isa and Dru said it as an observation, not a prophecy. The blue eyes detail was retroactively elevated into significance. Whether this is the show confirming that Arya was always the chosen one, or whether it is the show using existing dialogue cleverly after deciding to give Arya the Night King kill, is not cleanly resolved. Both readings are available. the prophecy does not close. This is, I think, the most interesting thing about how Game of Thrones handled the Azor Ahai mythology. It gave the prophecy to almost everyone, let none of them fully fit, and then had the Night King killed by someone the prophecy never named. The prophecy was not wrong exactly. Things happened broadly in line with what the legend described, but it was not a map. It was a general direction, subject to interpretation, capable of being wrong about the details while being approximately right about the shape. Meli Sahan Dru walked into the snow and died after the battle. She had served her purpose. Whatever she was for, and we will come back to that in the Lord of Light section, it was complete. She removed the necklace that kept her alive, aged instantly into the very old woman she actually was, and fell. Nobody said who Azor Ahai was. Nobody was named the prince that was promised by the story itself. The cat-spore dagger that Arya used was the same one used in the assassination attempt on Bran in Season 1, which is either a lovely callback or a meaningful structural loop, and the show seems comfortable, letting you decide which. There is something worth saying about how prophecy functions in this world as a structural element, separate from any one prophecy's specific content. Game of Thrones is full of predictions that come true in ways their interpreters do not expect. Maggie the Frog told Cersei accurate things about her life. The Ghost of High Heart told the Brotherhood without banners accurate things. The visions Nar Isis had in the House of the Undying were accurate about her dragons, though not about much else. These are not failures of prophetic accuracy, they are demonstrations of a consistent rule. Prophecies in this world tell true things in ways that cannot be fully understood until after the events have occurred. This makes prophecy, as an object in the world of Game of Thrones, interesting as something characters live with, and dangerous as something they act on. Meli Sahan Dru acted on her interpretation, and a child burned for it. Cersei acted on her understanding of Maggie's words and spent 2 decades in a state of heightened paranoia that warped every decision she made. Stannis, who was more skeptical of Mel Asan Dru than she was of herself, allowed himself to be persuaded and ended up dying in the snow, having lost everything. The Azor Ahai prophecy specifically seems to work by providing a shape, a general direction, without specifying the mechanism. Something was going to defeat the darkness, something reborn in unusual circumstances associated with fire and light was going to matter enormously in that confrontation. The prophecy was not wrong about this. It was wrong about which specific person would matter in which specific way, or rather, its interpreters were wrong, because they assumed one person was the fulfillment when the fulfillment required several people across several decades. Melisandre Dru preserved Jon. Jon trusted Arya. Arya had trained with the Faceless Men. Beric Dondarrion kept Arya alive in the crypts. Every link in that chain was in some way shaped by the Lord of Light's influence. The prophecy was pointing at a network, not a person. Whether that reading is the show's intention or an interpretation built in retrospect by fans looking for coherence is, again, an open question. The show does not confirm it. It just gives you the pieces. There is a line in Season 8, delivered by Varys to Jon in a quiet corridor at Dragonstone, that functions as the show's shorthand for everything that happens in the final episodes. He says, "They say when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin." Not brilliant or terrible, nothing in between, just whichever way the coin lands. The coin flipped on the bells. But let us talk about what happened before the bells, because the question of whether what Daenerys did was madness or decision is one the show sets up and then does not quite engage with directly. And it is the most interesting unresolved thread in her story. Between the end of Season 7 and the bells scene in Season 8, Daenerys is lost, in rough order. Viserion, her dragon, killed by the Night King's ice spear beyond the wall, and then reanimated as a weapon of the dead. Jorah Mormont, her oldest companion, and the person most fully devoted to her, killed defending her at the Battle of Winterfell. Missandei, her translator and closest friend, captured and then beheaded in front of her by Cersei's forces. Rhaegal, her second living dragon, shot out of the sky by Euron Greyjoy's scorpion bolts, in what was, in terms of military incompetence on the writer's part, a baffling ambush that none of her advisors apparently anticipated. And then, on top of all of that, Jon Snow, the person she had most recently allowed herself to love, pulled back from her physically because he now knew they were related and could not move past it. He told his secret to his sisters. His sisters told Tyrion. Tyrion told Varys. Varys started writing letters. She was alone. She said this explicitly to Jon in their last private scene together. All I have here is fear, not love. Not the fear she instilled in others. Her own fear, her isolation, her loss of every anchor to the things she had built her cause around. Jon told her he loved her and could not kiss her back when she leaned toward him. She looked at him and said, "All right then, let it be fear." That line, that is the moment, not the bells. The bells came after. That is the moment she made the decision, or at least the moment she articulated a philosophy that the burning of King's Landing is a direct expression of. The show frames the bells scene as Targaryen madness, the coin landing wrong. She looked at the Red Keep with what the episode describes as pure hatred, and then started burning. The city had surrendered. The war was won. She burned it anyway. Here is the thing though. The reading where it was madness and the reading where it was a calculation are not clearly distinguishable from each other by what the show actually shows you. She had already told Jon that fear was what she was going to use. She had already said that mercy was a kind of weakness the people of Westeros would exploit. What she did in King's Landing is a horrific atrocity by any reasonable measure. It is also coherent with the conclusion she had reached the night before about what ruling actually required. Her father, the Mad King Aerys, wanted to burn King's Landing rather than surrender to Robert Bu-Rath Eon's rebellion. He had wildfire cached beneath the city for exactly that purpose. Jaime Lannister killed him before he could give the order and became the Kingslayer. Daenerys did what her father wanted to do. The parallel is unavoidable, and the show absolutely intends it. But there is an additional layer. The political settlement that followed, elective monarchy, Bran as king, Sansa's North as an independent kingdom, might not have been achievable without the specific horror of King's Landing. If Cersei had simply surrendered and Daenerys had taken the city cleanly, the Lords of Westeros would have submitted to a Targaryen again, which is just the cycle continuing. What broke the cycle was the burning. The burning and Jon's response to it, and the political vacuum that created the space for Tyrion to suggest something different. Was Daenerys, in the worst way possible, accidentally right that breaking the wheel required destroying the symbol of the wheel? Was what she did necessary for the outcome that followed? And did Bran, sitting in his weirwood knowledge, know that and allow it? The show does not answer this. It does not even quite ask it. It lets the burning be what it visibly is, a monstrous act, without fully engaging with the structural argument underneath. There is another layer to the bells scene that I have always found worth sitting with. Cersei was watching from the Red Keep as King's Landing burned. She had placed civilian hostages throughout the city, and below the walls, ordinary people, in the line of fire, as a calculated bet that Daenerys would not harm innocents. Daenerys burned them. But before the burning started, before Daenerys made her choice, Cersei stood at the window and watched her plan working. The city had surrendered. The bells were ringing. Daenerys had apparently chosen mercy. And then Cersei watched the smoke rise anyway. Cersei spent the final minutes of her life watching the city burn around the Red Keep, and understanding that she had been wrong about the coin flip. She had been wrong about how ruthless Daenerys would ultimately be. And there is something quietly devastating about that, alongside everything else that was devastating about it. That Cersei's political calculation, her reading of her enemy, her bet on Daenerys' mercy, was the one that failed. All her life, she had been the most cynical person in any room she entered. She was not cynical enough about this one. She died in the rubble with Jaime, who came back for her, who had spent seasons trying to be better than his worst self, and came back to Cersei at the end because he could not be anything other than what he was to her. "I want our baby to live," she said, or something like it, in their last moments. Whether she was pregnant at all, whether that pregnancy was real, or a manipulation, or simply a story she told herself to hold on to something, the show never fully confirmed. She died believing it, which may be the most honest thing the show could give her at the end. Drogon's response is the final mystery of her story. He arrived, found her dead in Jon's arms, let out an anguished roar, and then did not kill Jon. He has always protected her. Every other time she was threatened, the dragons reacted with fire. Jon killed her, and the dragon did not burn him. Instead, he burned the Iron Throne, melted it to slag, and then picked up Daenerys' body and flew east. Why the throne and not Jon? The show does not explain this. The most common interpretation is that Drogon, in his grief, understood on some instinctive level that the throne was the cause of what had happened to his mother, that the Iron Throne was what the obsession with power had done to her, and destroying it was a kind of response to that. Whether a dragon can reason this way is a question the show leaves very open. He was last reported flying toward Volantes. Sam mentioned it in a small council scene. Bran said he would try to find him. Volantes is significant because it is where Kinvara, the High Priestess of the Lord of Light, is based. She appeared briefly in Season 6 and expressed complete certainty that Daenerys was the chosen queen. The theory, never confirmed, is that Drogon took Daenerys ISS to Volantis to be resurrected by a Red Priestess. House of the Dragon later showed us how Targaryens perform cremations using their dragons, which is a different reading. Drogon performing a Targaryen funeral rite, taking her to Valyria, or somewhere meaningful to the bloodline, to give her fire and blood. Neither interpretation is confirmed. Drogon's destination, and whether Daenerys Targaryen is definitively gone, is one of the few things the show actively left open in its final episode, rather than by omission. They mentioned it and pointed at Bran, and then did not show what happened next. There is a thread in the Daenerys ISS story that the show raised and then walked away from, which is the question of what she believed about herself. In the final moments of her life, she gave a speech after the burning of King's Landing that is one of the most interesting pieces of writing in the final season. Standing above the ruins, with Drogon and the surviving Unsullied and Dothraki gathered below her, she told them they had liberated the people of King's Landing, and that their work was not done, that there were more cities to liberate, more people in chains. She spoke about breaking the wheel, about building the world anew. She was not, in that moment, performing villainy. She was not cackling over the ruins. She appeared to believe entirely in what she had done and what she was about to do. Jon saw this. Tyrion saw this. And it is what made Jon's eventual decision to kill her not a simple moral calculation, but an agonizing one, because she was not wrong that the world needed changing, and she was not wrong that the people who had suffered under previous regimes deserved something better. She was catastrophically wrong about the method, but the vision she was trying to implement was not without merit. What would Westeros have looked like under Daenerys ISS had Jon not killed her? She had ended slavery in 3 major Slava cities. She had built coalitions across very different groups of people. She had, before the events of the final season, demonstrated both strategic brilliance and extraordinary courage. The show does not answer this question at all. It needed her dead for the political situation to resolve, and so she died. But the question of what she was building toward, whether any version of it was achievable, or whether the costs would always have been this high, sits in the show's margins, unanswered. There is a scene in Season 3, in the crypts beneath King's Landing, where Varys finishes telling Tyr on the story of how he was castrated as a child. He was sold to a sorcerer in Myr, given a paralysing potion, and operated on, deliberately, ritually, as part of a ceremony. The sorcerer burned the removed parts in a brazier of blue fire and chanted over them, and a voice answered from the flames. Not a god, Varys says, not a demon, maybe just parlour tricks. He never knew. The sorcerer threw him out afterward to die on the street. But what he never forgot, what gave him recurring nightmares for decades, was that something spoke from those flames in response to the ceremony. Something was there. Then he opens a wooden crate he's been working on throughout the conversation, and inside it is the sorcerer. Still alive, still gagged. Shipped to Varys from across the world over years, because Varys eventually had the reach to find him and have him brought. You'll get your revenge if you have the stomach for it, Varys tells Tyr, closing the crate again. And revenge. It is one of the most effective character moments in the series, and it does two things simultaneously. It explains why Varys hates magic, and those who wield it. Every person who claimed divine power reminded him of the sorcerer who used him as a sacrifice and threw him away. And it raises a question that the show never answers. What was the voice? Varys built an information network that extended across 2 continents. His little birds, former beggar children recruited and trained to move invisibly and remember everything, were the backbone of it. But the scope of what Varys knew always seemed to exceed what any human network could produce. He knew things that happened in private rooms with no witnesses. He knew Tyr-Eon's plans before Tyr-Eon had fully decided on them. He seemed to anticipate developments that had not yet occurred. In Meereen, in Season 6, a high priestess of the Lord of Light named Kinvara came to pledge the temple's support to Du-Nar-Yess's campaign. Varys was suspicious, and said so. She looked at him and said, very quietly, that she knew about the sorcerer and the ritual with the flames, and could tell him exactly what answered from those flames if he wanted to know. Varys was visibly shaken and said nothing in response to Kinvara. She knew things she could not have known through ordinary means. Just as Varys knew things he could not have known through ordinary means. And the implication is not subtle. Whatever answered from the flames in that ceremony in Myr was connected to R'hllor, the Lord of Light, whose servants have been appearing throughout the series, doing documented supernatural things. And whatever it was connected to Varys, had been watching him, or aware of him, from that moment, which raises the possibility that Varys, who hated magic and magical practitioners, and spent his life claiming to serve only the realm and the common people, was himself a tool of the same divine or cosmic power he despised. That the voice in the flames knew 40 years ago that this scarred and resourceful child would eventually be exactly positioned to shift the balance of Westerosi politics toward an outcome the Lord of Light wanted, and that what Varys experienced as his own careful ambition was, at least partially, a plan he did not know he was executing. The show does not confirm this. It places the pieces next to each other and moves on. Varys' death scene is worth looking at with this in mind. He was writing letters when Grey Worm came for him, spreading the truth of Jon's parentage, ensuring the information was seeded across the realm before Du-Nar-Yess could contain it. He burned the current letter when he heard the guards approaching. He knew what was coming. He accepted it without resistance. He told Tyr quietly that he hoped he was wrong about Du-Nar-Yess, and then he walked to the beach to be executed. The letters were already gone. Whatever he needed to set in motion, he had set in motion. His death in this reading was not a failure. It was the end of a function. He had done what he was for. He went to it without panic, the way someone goes to an ending they have been expecting. Whether that was the calculated calm of a supremely pragmatic man who had accepted the consequence of his last gamble, or whether something deeper had told him that this was how it ended and that it was enough, the show leaves that entirely to you. I want to say something about Varys as a character that I think gets lost in the discussion of his mystery, which is that he is the show's most sincere proponent of the idea that the person at the top matters. Every other major character in Game of Thrones has a primary loyalty that is personal, to family, to a cause, to a specific person. Varys is the one who consistently frames his choices in terms of what is good for the ordinary people of Westeros. The small folk, the ones who have no power over who rules and who suffer the most when rulers are incompetent or cruel. He says this so often that it sounds like a politician's talking point, and for a long time the show lets you wonder if it is. But the evidence of his actions supports it. He worked against Joffrey, a sadist whose continued rule was catastrophic for the people of King's Landing. He worked to position Rhaenyra ISS as an alternative, not because he particularly loved Targaryens, but because he believed she actually cared about the people she was meant to serve. When he concluded she did not, he switched again. His information network, in this framing, was not primarily a source of power for its own sake. It was the tool of someone who believed that knowing what was actually happening to ordinary people, as opposed to what the nobility was telling each other was happening, was the first requirement of good governance. Whether that is what a ruler or whatever answered from those flames was cultivating in him, or whether it was simply who Varys was, the show chose not to say. He is, alongside Tyr Eon, the character I would most like to have seen in a longer story with a longer reckoning. What he knew, what he believed, what the voice in the flames actually was, these are questions that the show built carefully and then left at exactly the point of maximum interest. The first thing Jon Snow said when he woke up after being murdered by his own men was not a name or a cry or a prayer. Davos Seaworth, who had been the one to suggest trying the resurrection ritual in the first place, stood by while Meli Sahun Drew asked him if he remembered anything. And Jon, still processing the experience of his own stab wounds, said, "Nothing at all." He'd expected something. Everyone expects something. Every religion in the known world has some account of what lies beyond death. The seven have their seven heavens. The drowned god speaks of what is dead, that may never die, ruler of an endless struggle between light and dark. Jon Snow died, and there was nothing on the other side, just absence. And then he woke up in a room with ghosts looking at him. Beric Dondarrion, who had been resurrected multiple times before Jon, described the experience differently. Not as nothing, but as progressive loss. Each time he came back, pieces of himself did not come back with him. Memories, parts of who he had been. He said he would not wish his resurrected life on anyone because the cost of it was gradually losing yourself to the process. Jon came back seemingly whole. Whatever toll Beric paid with each resurrection, Jon either paid it silently or something about his particular case was different. Why Jon specifically? Meli Sahun Drew performed the ritual with no faith. She said so explicitly. She had lost faith in the Lord of Light after Stannis' death. She did not believe the ritual would work. She went through the motions because Davos asked her to, and because there was nothing left to lose. She left the room. She was not in it when Jon woke up. So whatever brought Jon back, it was not contingent on Meli Sahun Drew's belief. It was not her prayer being answered. Something had already decided that Jon Snow was coming back, and Meli Sahun Drew was just the mechanism. Her interpretation, when she recovered enough to form one, was simple. Stannis was not the prince that was promised, but someone had to be. The Lord of Light had a plan that included Jon Snow living through the things he had not yet done. Now, his parentage. Jon is Aegon Targaryen, EN, the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, who were secretly and consensually married before Lyanna died, giving birth to him at the Tower of Joy. Ned Stark raised him as his bastard son to hide his identity from Robert Baratheon, who would have had him killed as a Targaryen heir. Jon's true parentage was confirmed by Bran's green sight in Season 7 and expanded upon through Sam's revelation and its consequences in Season 8. As the legitimate son of Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Jon Snow has a stronger claim to the Iron Throne than Daenerys, who is Rhaegar's younger half-sister. The dragons accepted him. He rode Rhaegal. When Daenerys stroked Drogon's nose in Season 8, the dragon, fiercely protective of her, allowed it with something that looked like recognition. And then the secret destroyed everything it touched. Jon told Sansa and Arya because he felt they had the right to know. Sansa told Tyrion because she did not trust Daenerys. Tyrion told Varys because Varys needed to know. Varys wrote a letter revealing Jon's true parentage to an unknown recipient. The secret, which had been kept for years by Ned Stark at the cost of his honour and the fiction of his own infidelity, spread across the political landscape in a matter of weeks and helped trigger the sequence of events that ended with King's Landing burning. Jon's Targaryen heritage was both the most significant fact about him and the least useful fact about him. It confirmed his legitimacy and identified him as a rival to Daenerys, but he did not want the throne, could not use the claim to do anything other than destabilise the alliance he was in, and in the end used none of the power the heritage supposedly conferred. He killed Daenerys with a plain knife. He was sentenced to the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch, which had been founded specifically to guard against White Walkers. The White Walkers were gone. The Watch still existed, Tyrion explained, as a place for the banished and the unfortunate. A quarantine more than a defence. Jon rode north. He passed through Castle Black. He walked beyond the wall with Tormund and the Free Folk, into the haunted forest, into the white and the cold. The show's final image of him is that walk, into the north, past the tree line, into whatever is up there now that the dead have gone. The Free Folk following behind him, Ghost running alongside. Where did he go? What did he build? Did he find peace in the north, or did he spend his life unable to stop thinking about what he had done? The show ends before any of it is answered. He walked out of the frame and did not come back. There is a reading of Jon Snow's entire arc that is almost too bleak to sit with for very long, which is that he was a man who did the right thing at every significant decision point and was punished for almost all of them. He brought the wildlings through the wall to save them from the White Walkers and was murdered by his own men for it. He was resurrected for a purpose that was implied to him, but never laid out in a single, definitive explanation. He killed the woman he loved because it was the only way to prevent a catastrophic continuation of what she was doing. He was sent back to the Night's Watch as a political compromise, sent to guard a wall that no longer served its purpose, and eventually just walked north into the cold. There is also a reading where that walk is exactly right, where Jon, who was always most himself beyond the wall, with the Free Folk who treated him as Jon rather than as Ned Stark's bastard, or Aegon Targaryen, or the prince that was promised, finally got to go home, to the place that made the most sense for him. Where Ghost was there, and Tormund was there, and the forest was full of living people he had fought alongside, and the silence of the north was not isolation, but peace. Both readings are available. The show does not close either one, and that is probably the most honest thing it could do with Jon Snow, who spent 8 seasons being pulled between 2 versions of himself, the person who belonged in the political world of Westeros, and the person who is most fully alive north of the wall, and whose story ends with him finally walking toward the thing that always called to him. His resurrection, in the end, may have been for exactly one thing. The moment he drove a blade into Daenerys' chest in the throne room. If the Lord of Light preserved him to do that and nothing else, then everything that came before and after was his own. The struggles at Castle Black, the Battle of the Bastards, the Beyond the Wall expedition, the love with Daenerys that made the killing possible and terrible simultaneously. All of it his, not the god's. The god needed the outcome. Jon lived the life. There is one more thing worth noting about Jon and the Night's Watch, which is the quiet absurdity of the institution at the show's end. The Night's Watch was founded after the Long Night to guard against the White Walkers. It maintained this function for 8,000 years, an enormous historical duration, across the rise and fall of kingdoms and the entire recorded history of Westeros. And then the White Walkers were defeated in a single night, and the Night's Watch was immediately without a purpose. Tyrion's solution, keeping it as an exile colony for the banished and the unfortunate, is pragmatic in a way that is also faintly absurd. Jon, the most significant Lord Commander in the Watch's history, the man who was killed and resurrected while serving it, was sentenced back to it as a political compromise. He arrived, he passed through, he walked out the other side and kept going north, past the ruins of what the Watch had been, into the forest where it had always been pointing. What he found there, the show does not say. Maybe that is the point. His story, in the end, is about a man who was the answer to a question nobody fully asked. He was the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne who did not want it. He was the man who killed the woman he loved because it was the only way to stop her. He was resurrected for a purpose that was never stated outright, and that he fulfilled without ever fully understanding it. He was the prince that was promised, arguably, in the sense that he was the one who finally made the sacrifice. The legend described not fire against darkness, but love destroyed to prevent greater destruction. And then he walked north, which is the most Jon Snow ending possible. Let us start with the most direct piece of evidence, because it is easy to forget how specific and strange it is. In Season 2, Mel Isundru and Davos Seaworth rode through the caves beneath Renly Bu Rath Eun's camp in the Stormlands. Mel Isundru was heavily pregnant in a way she had not been the day before. She delivered what appeared to be a living shadow, a being of darkness in the approximate shape of a man, and Davos watched this happen in absolute horror. The shadow went into the camp and killed Renly Bu Rath Eun. Multiple witnesses, Renly simply died, stabbed by something made of darkness. This is not ambiguous. This is not metaphor. This is a documented supernatural occurrence in the primary narrative of the show. Magic exists in this world, and the Lord of Light's priestesses can do things that have no natural explanation. Beric Dondarrion was resurrected 6 times by Thoros of Myr, a red priest who had served in Westeros for years, and who admitted when it first worked that he had been going through the motions of the ritual out of habit rather than faith. He did not expect it to work. It worked anyway. Beric walked around as a man who had died 6 times, with slightly less of himself intact after each resurrection. Then Mel Isundru resurrected Jon, again without expecting it to work. And it worked anyway. Whatever the ritual is doing, it does not require the priest's belief in order to function. It is not faith healing. It is something that operates with or without the practitioner's confidence in the result. Kainvara, the high priestess of the Red Temple in Volantis, knew private details about Varys' past that she could not have obtained through any normal means. She knew the specific words the sorcerer had used in the ceremony. She knew what voice had called back from the flames. This was information that existed in Varys' memory, and nowhere else that was accessible to any human intelligence network. She had it anyway. Mel Isundru herself was hundreds of years old. The necklace she wore maintained a glamour that made her appear as a young woman. When she removed it in Season 6, in a scene that felt deliberately small and private. Just Melisandre and a mirror late at night, she was revealed as an ancient, frail woman who should not have been alive by any ordinary measure. Something had been keeping her body functional for centuries. She had been preserved for the work she had not yet done. The same is true of Beric. He was kept alive through 6 deaths because he had a role to play that was not finished. That role turned out to be getting Arya Stark through the burning crypts of Winterfell during the Battle of the Long Night to the Godswood. He used his final resurrection, shielding her from whites long enough for her to reach Melisandre. And then he died, his last death. No more resurrections, he was done. Melisandre died shortly after the Night King fell. When the battle was over and dawn had broken, she walked out into the snow, removed her necklace, and aged into dust. Her work was done too. 2 servants of the Lord of Light, both preserved past any natural lifespan, both released from that preservation in connection with the same battle, though one fell before the Night King was slain, and the other only afterward. The god or the force or the intelligence or whatever it is has a very specific economy. It preserves its tools exactly as long as they are needed. What is Rilla? The show does not say. It is clearly not a fiction. The things its servants do are real and documented. But whether it is a divine being with intentions and plans in the human sense, or whether it is something more like a force that moves through people toward an outcome without anything like consciousness, is left entirely open. The priests speak of it as a god, as a father, as a divine will. Whether it is any of those things from the inside, whether there is an inside, nobody in the show knows. There is one more detail about Melisandre's death that I find quietly extraordinary. She did not die in battle. She was not killed by an enemy. She walked out into the snow after the Night King fell and removed her necklace and stopped. She had been kept alive for centuries. A human body maintained past its natural lifespan by whatever the necklace was doing, and the moment her function was complete, the maintenance stopped, as if whatever had been running the extension cord simply unplugged it. That specificity is what makes the Lord of Light feel like something real in the show's universe, rather than a narrative device. It is not just that Melisandre was powerful and helpful and then died. It is that she died immediately, upon the completion of her specific purpose, in a way that suggests her lifespan was always going to end at exactly that point, rather than at any random later time. Whatever kept her alive knew when to stop. That kind of economy implies agency in the source, or something that functions like it. The most honest accounting of what the show gives us is this: something exists that can resurrect the dead, create creatures of living shadow, preserve human life beyond its natural end, and apparently knows specific private information about specific private people. It operates through its servants in ways those servants do not fully understand. It allowed its servants to be wrong about Stannis. It worked toward an outcome that involved Arya killing the Night King. It released its instruments when their functions were complete. Whether that makes it a god depends on your definition. The show will not give you one. Which is consistent with how Game of Thrones handles every large metaphysical question. It gives you the evidence and lets you draw the conclusion. It is, in this way, more honest about the limits of what anyone can know about the nature of divine power than most fantasy stories that traffic in gods and prophecy. Nobody in the show knows what the Lord of Light is. They just know what it does. There is a detail about the Lord of Light's presence in the world that the show treats almost as background noise, but that becomes significant if you pay attention to it. The Red Temples. There is a major temple of Rus in Volantis, and the show treats his worship as a widespread Essosi faith, a network of organised red priesthoods, serving the same god across a vast geographic area, each shaping its own relationship to the faith. The Lord of Light is not an obscure deity, it is a major organised religion with widespread temples, priesthood, an influence across Essos, which means whatever the Lord of Light did to preserve Melisahn, Druch and Beric and resurrect Jon, it has been doing things, through its priesthood, for a very long time. Kinvara spoke about events in Du Naeris's life, as though they were revealed in advance through the power of the Lord of Light. The Faith had been expecting, or at least anticipating, something like what happened in the final seasons. They may have been working toward it in small ways for much longer than the show covers. What that means about the nature of the divine plan, how far back it goes, how specifically it was known, is not something the show engages with directly. But the existence of an organised religious network, built around a god that demonstrably works, suggests a world in which divine intervention is not random and miraculous, but systematic and deliberate, which is either more comforting or less comforting than the alternative, depending on how you feel about being part of someone else's plan. Whether that makes it a god depends on your definition. The show will not give you one. There is a flashback at the very beginning of Season 5 that you could, if you were watching quickly, dismiss as scene-setting atmosphere. Young Cersei is bratty and imperious even as a child, dragging her nervous companion Melara through the woods of the Westerlands to find a fortune-teller. They reach a hovel. Inside is a woman called Maggie, a woods witch, who agrees to answer 3 questions after Cersei pricks her finger on a dagger and Maggie tastes the blood. The 3 answers Maggie gives are specific, and every single one of them came true. You will never wed the prince. You will wed the king. You will marry the king. Cersei wanted to marry Prince Rhaegar. She married Robert Bu-Rath Eon instead, who became king after Rhaegar's father was deposed. The king will have 20 children, but you will have 3. Gold will be their crowns, and gold their burial shrouds. Robert fathered children with various women across the kingdom. Cersei had 3 illegitimate children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen. All 3 were dead by the end of Season 6. Queen you shall be, until there comes another younger and more beautiful to cast you down and take all you hold dear. Cersei ruled as queen. She cast down Margaery Tyrell and was ultimately cast down by Du Naeris. Both fit parts of the description, depending on what you count as all she held dear. All 3 prophecies fulfilled. That is not ambiguous. That is a witch in the woods, accurately describing the shape of a life to a child who had no reason to know it was coming. Now, in the books, not in the show, which is important, Maggie gives Cersei a 4th piece. She says that the Valonqar will wrap his hands around Cersei's pale white throat and choke the life from her. Valonqar is High Valyrian for little brother. The show cut this entirely. Cersei's interpretation in the books was that the Valonqar was Tyrion, her despised younger brother, the one she always blamed for their mother's death in childbirth, the one Tywin hated and she resented. She spent years watching him with that prophecy in mind. But the Valyrian word could equally refer to Jaime, who is technically the younger of the twins, born 2nd minutes after Cersei. On the show, Cersei died under rubble in the collapsing Red Keep, with Jaime beside her. Not strangled, not by any brother's hands. Jaime was there, but not as an executioner, as a companion in death, trying to hold her together in their last moments. He told her to keep her eyes closed. Just keep her eyes closed as the ceiling came down. Whether the show's decision to drop the Valonqar prophecy means the writers were planning a different death for her that they ultimately did not execute, or whether they simply chose not to carry a book element that the show's different pacing could not support, is not something that has been clearly explained in the years since. The writers have not said much about it. What is interesting about the Valonqar question is what it says about how the show handled prophecy in general. The prophecies Maggie gives in the books form a loose set, some are fulfilled, others remain uncertain at the point the books leave off. On the show, cutting the 4th prophecy makes the set feel incomplete, and slightly arbitrary. 3 prophecies, all fulfilled, with a 4th from the books about the Valonqar left out of the show. It is also worth noting that the younger and more beautiful Queen prophecy is never cleanly settled on the show. Was it Margaery who took Cersei's place at Joffrey's side and was more beloved by the city? Was it Daenerys who ultimately took everything Cersei built? The show suggests both without naming one, which is either deliberate ambiguity or uncertainty about the answer. Cersei's prophecy has one additional dimension that the show handles very quietly, which is the question of what knowing your future does to the quality of your present. Cersei received that prophecy as a young girl, probably around 13 or 14. She then spent the next 30 or more years living with the knowledge that her children would all die and that she would be cast down by someone younger and more beautiful. That is an enormous weight to carry. That is the kind of knowledge that would distort every relationship, every decision, every moment of apparent happiness. If the crown will always be taken, if the children will always be taken, what exactly are you protecting when you protect them? The show does not frame Cersei's paranoia as a symptom of prophecy's weight. It frames it as character, as the natural result of being who she was in the world she was in. But the two things are not separable. Cersei knew what was coming in general shape, could not know the mechanism or the order, and built walls around herself and her children that became, over time, the very thing that isolated her. Her son Tommen died partly because she had taught him to rule in a court full of enemies without teaching him how to identify and navigate those enemies. Her children died in part because she shielded them from the knowledge that would have prepared them, because every piece of knowledge the world had about the Lan Iacesta family's crimes and compromises was a potential weapon against them. The prophecy may have contributed to its own fulfillment, not through magic, but through the ordinary human mechanism of a person living in fear of an outcome, and thereby helping to create it. The show does not state this directly. It does not need to. There is a broader observation to make about prophecy in this world that I have been circling around, and might as well say directly. Game of Thrones treats prophecy not as a divine gift, or as a narrative cheat, the mechanism that allows the audience to know the plot in advance, but as a burden. The people who have access to prophetic information are not advantaged by it. They are shaped by it, distorted by it, made into specific kinds of people by the knowledge of what is coming. Cersei became paranoid and controlling. Stannis became willing to do the unthinkable. Melisahun Drew spent her long life wrong about Stannis before being right about Arya in a way she could not have passed until the moment it happened. The 7 gods of Westeros, the faith of the 7, which is the religion of the Andals who migrated to Westeros thousands of years ago, appear in the show as an institution, as politics, as ceremony. But the 7 themselves are almost entirely absent. We never see evidence of the 7 doing anything. No miracles, no interventions, no divine presence. The High Sparrow wielded enormous power and claimed to act in the name of the 7, but the 7 never seemed to back him up. Whether this means the 7 are not real, or simply less interventionist than the Lord of Light, or real, but operating on a timescale too large for the show to observe, is one of those questions the show never even asks. It is just there in the background, an entire major religion that may or may not have anything behind it. Prophecy in this world works by being true in general and unreliable in detail. The shape of things comes through. The specific mechanism does not. Cersei knew she would have 3 children and that they would all die. She did not know how, or in what order, or what she would feel when each one went. The prophecy told her the destination and gave her 20 years to walk toward it without being able to change the route. There is something almost unbearable in that if you sit with it. She built everything she built trying to protect her children and her position. The prophecy told her the children would die and she would be cast down. She could not stop her 3 royal children from dying, nor prevent a younger, more beautiful queen from casting her down and taking everything she held dear. Whether the things she did to try to prevent it actually caused it, whether Joffrey survived, as long as he did because of her protection, and whether that protection of a cruel king accelerated the very political instability that eventually destroyed the Lannisters, is a question the show raises through implication and never formally asks. The very first episode of Game of Thrones opens with the Night's Watch Ranger beyond the wall finding the White Walkers' massacre site. It is winter, it is cold, the forest is dark, and then the first conversation of any substance that happens at Winterfell is about the seasons. Specifically, about how long the current summer has been. A little over 10 years. That's unusually long for a summer in Westeros, and the Maesters who monitor the march of the seasons at the Citadel and use that data to determine when the current season will change, are worried, because a 9-year summer is widely believed to mean an equally long winter is coming. Winter is coming, as a Stark motto, is not just an aesthetic choice, it is a genuine warning about a climate that works on a scale no single human life can fully account for. Westeros and Essos have seasons that last years. Sometimes they last for years at a time. The length is unpredictable and varies randomly. No one can tell you how long a summer will be until it is already running long. No one can tell you when winter will end. The Maesters keep detailed records and make their best estimates, but their seasonal predictions are widely regarded as an inexact science. The show never explains why. There are hints. The most explicit is a suggestion, mentioned in passing by multiple characters, that the irregular seasons are not natural in origin, that they stem from the long night, the catastrophic supernatural winter 8,000 years earlier that coincided with the White Walkers' invasion. The theory is that whatever the children of the forest or the White Walkers or the magic of the long night did to the world was significant enough to permanently alter the planet's seasonal rhythm. The seasons were broken in that event and never recovered. The Masters, characteristically, are deeply skeptical of this. They dismiss it as folklore. They are the show's institutional representatives of rational inquiry, and they have a consistent and somewhat frustrating tendency to disbelieve anything supernatural, even as supernatural things visibly happen around them. The wall exists, as one character notes, and that alone should give a reasonable person pause about dismissing mythology. Whether the Night King's presence in the south intensified the cold is also suggested rather than confirmed. The spreading winter in seasons 7 and 8 tracked roughly with the army of the dead's approach. When the Night King died at Winterfell, the immediate supernatural cold that had been deepening seemed to ease. Whether that means the seasons will stabilise in the aftermath, whether the battle's outcome fixed what the long night broke, the show does not address. The final season ends in winter, and we never see what comes after it. The children of the forest are their own piece of this. They appear in the show in only a handful of scenes, mostly in connection with the cave of the three-eyed raven or its defences. In the show, the children of the forest use dragonglass weapons and cast ancient spells that prevent White Walkers from entering the three-eyed raven's cave, but their ability to create fire barriers is never directly shown or explained. They created the Night King. They spent 8,000 years trying to contain what they had made. The last ones died in the cave attack in Season 6. Whether there are others elsewhere in the deep forests of Westeros or somewhere in Essos is never addressed. The show presents their extinction as a background tragedy and does not dwell on it. A species that had lived on the continent for tens of thousands of years, since before humans arrived, that had built a culture around nature and the weirwood trees and a relationship with the natural world that humans never quite understood, simply gone. What are the old gods? The children worshipped them. The first men adopted them when they made peace with the children thousands of years ago. The weirwood trees are their sacred objects, their faces carved into the bark staring outward. Bran communed with whatever lives in the Weirwood network when he became the three-eyed raven. Are the old gods conscious? Are they the collected memories of everyone who has ever touched the Weirwood network? Are they something older, a genuine non-human intelligence predating even the children? The show gestures at the Weirwood network as something vast and connected and real, but what it is in any metaphysical sense is never defined. One of the stranger implications of Bran's abilities is that the Weirwood network is, in some sense, a form of collective memory that persists across death. Bran can see the past through the trees. He saw events that happened long ago in locations where Weirwood trees were present, as if the trees had been recording what happened around them. This makes the Weirwood faces, the carved eyes and open mouths, present across Westeros, from the Godswood of Winterfell to the Isle of Faces, something more than religious iconography. They are, if Bran's abilities are what they appear to be, actual recording devices, witnesses to the entirety of Westerosi history. The Night King wanted to erase all living memory of the world of men. Bran is the living memory, but the Weirwood trees are the persistent memory, distributed, rooted, not dependent on any one person's survival. If the Night King killed Bran, the Weirwood network would still contain everything it had ever witnessed. Would that have mattered to him? Was the Weirwood network also a target? And if so, how would he have addressed it? The show raises the connection between Bran and the trees, and does not explore what that connection means for the Night King's goal, beyond the narrow question of killing the current three-eyed raven. The old gods in this reading might be the Weirwood network itself, not a deity above the trees, but the accumulated observation of thousands of years of history embedded in the wood. Something that does not act so much as remember, something that Bran is now the interface for, in a human body with human limitations, trying to govern a kingdom while carrying the weight of everything that has ever happened in this world. That is a lot to sit with, which is perhaps why the small council meetings in the finale were mostly about brothels and ships. You have to start somewhere. The wall itself is worth a moment. Legend has it the wall was built by Brandon the Builder, with the help of giants and the children of the forest's magic, to prevent the White Walkers from crossing south. Maintained for 8,000 years by the Night's Watch, and apparently by the structural magic of its construction. When the Night King flew Viserion at it, in the Season 7 finale, the eastern section collapsed into the sea. A gap opened large enough for the entire army of the dead to march through. The Night's Watch now exists, per the final episode, as a kind of exile colony rather than a defence force. There are no more White Walkers to guard against. The breach in the wall presumably still exists. What happens to the wall, whether it is repaired, whether without the Night King's threat it matters at all, whether the magic that held it together for 8 millennia remains, the show has left to your imagination. Jon Snow walked north through the gates of Castle Black and past the wall's shadow into the haunted forest. Whatever comes next for that world, the camera did not follow it far enough to show. The wildlings, the free folk, are an interesting coda to the whole mythology of the seasons and the long night, and one the show did not develop fully. They are the descendants of first men who were trapped beyond the wall when it was constructed 8,000 years ago. They lived north of the wall, not because they were barbarians by nature, but because the wall was built around them before they could return south. They developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own relationship with the land and the cold and the things that lived beyond the northern horizon. They knew about the White Walkers because they had been living with that threat at their backs in recent years, while the people south of the wall had the luxury of treating the whole thing as a myth. This is one of the show's subtler points about institutional knowledge and who gets to decide what counts as legitimate information. The Night's Watch spent decades dismissing wildling reports of White Walker sightings as superstition, because the Night's Watch was an institution of the southern kingdoms with southern assumptions about what was real. The wildlings were right. They were right for thousands of years while the Watch and the Maesters and the Lords of Westeros were wrong. Now the White Walkers are gone. The wall still stands partially. The free folk are south of it, or at least Jon is leading them south, and their relationship to Westeros proper is completely unaddressed at the show's end. What happens to the wildlings in the political settlement that follows? Do they get land, recognition? Do they remain separate? The show ends before any of this is answered, leaving an entire people whose story intersected significantly with the main plot in an uncertain state. The Citadel is another element that deserved more. The Order of Maesters, scholars, physicians, record keepers, the people who run the intellectual infrastructure of Westeros, appears throughout the show as a background institution, and the only extended time we spend with it in a major storyline is Sam's arc in Oldtown, which ends somewhat abruptly when Sam takes some books and leaves. What the Citadel knows, what its archives contain, whether there is a record somewhere of everything the show's mythology touched on, the Long Night, the Children of the Forest, the origin of the White Walkers, is never established. The show implies an enormous archive of human knowledge and never looks inside it. There is a version of Game of Thrones where every mystery gets resolved, where the Night King delivers a monologue explaining his origins and his philosophy before he dies, where a White Walker is captured and studied and found to have a culture and a language and an account of 8,000 years of existence in the permanent dark, where the Lord of Light makes itself known in some clear and unambiguous form, where someone asks Bran directly and on screen whether he knew what was coming and let it happen, and Bran gives a real answer. That version of the show would have been longer and more expensive, and I suspect significantly less interesting, because the explanations in most cases would be smaller than the questions. The Night King with a philosophy is a villain. The Night King without one is a force. The Lord of Light with a defined nature is a deity in a fantasy story. The Lord of Light is something that resurrects the dead and preserves its servants and operates through their lives toward outcomes they cannot see, is stranger and more unsettling and more honest about what the show is doing with faith and power. What Game of Thrones was always doing, at its best, which was not always the same as its most popular moments, was building a world that felt real in the way that history feels real, incomplete, full of causes that ran further back than anyone had documented and consequences that ran further forward than anyone could see. A world where the people living in it did not have access to the complete explanation of the thing they were part of, where the masters were right to study the evidence and wrong to dismiss the evidence they did not like, where prophecies told true things in oblique ways and the interpretations were always partial, where the great enemy of all life had been waiting for so long that no one alive could remember why or when or what had first set him moving. Some of what got left open was the show running out of source material and having to navigate without a map. The Valonqar prophecy dropped, Jon's post-finale story unshown, the White Walker civilization whose silhouette was drawn but never filled in. These feel like things that might have been addressed in a longer final season, or in source material that has not yet arrived, and some of what got left open was a deliberate and correct artistic choice. The Night King's nature, Varys' voice in the flames, Bran's long game, the Lord of Light's true character. These are mysteries that work better as mysteries, because they are doing something the explanations could not do. They are making the world feel larger than the story. There is something specific to Game of Thrones mysteries that distinguishes them from the mysteries of other dense mythological series. Most shows with complicated lore build toward revelation. The mysteries are promises of explanation, hooks designed to keep you watching until the answer arrives. Game of Thrones built mysteries that were not promises, they were just the texture of the world. The Night King's nature was not a mystery being held for a reveal, it was the shape of what the show chose to make him. and that shape was permanently incomplete. There was no episode planned in which a character sat down and explained the White Walker perspective. That episode was never going to exist. This is unusual. It requires a different relationship with the fiction. Not, I wonder what the answer is, but there is no answer here, and that is itself information about what kind of world this is. A world with gaps in its own mythology is a world that feels real in a particular way, because the real world has enormous gaps in its mythology. We do not know why civilizations fell. We do not know what daily life felt like in most of recorded human history. We do not know why the people who built the monuments built them, or what they believed the monuments meant. The gaps are not failures of documentation. They are simply the distance between the past and the present, which is always greater than any archive can bridge. Game of Thrones at its best created that same feeling in miniature. A world with too much history to account for. Too many causes lost behind too many centuries. Too many things that happened in permanent darkness, where no one with writing was watching. Something worth noting, before we let the whole thing settle. The show told us almost nothing about the east of Essos beyond Daenerys' storyline, and nothing whatsoever about what is west of Westeros across the Sunset Sea. Arya sailed toward it at the end of the final season. She has always been the character most interested in what lies beyond the edges of the known world. The show ends with her heading toward the great blank space on every map. This is either a deliberate opening, the show saying that the story continues past the frame, that there is more world than any version of this tale can contain, or it is simply the show not being able to follow her further without creating a spin-off. Both can be true, but the effect is the same. The world of Game of Thrones has a west that nobody has documented, and a beyond the wall north that nobody has fully explored, and an east that continues past the edge of the known world. The mysteries we have discussed tonight are the mysteries of the known parts. The unknown parts are much larger. Arya is out there somewhere. She's been trained in skills that let her change her face and move invisibly through the world. She has a list of names that got shorter over the seasons. She has a castle-forged steel sword called Needle, which she wields in the Braavosi water dancing style. She's on a ship heading west into water that the mapmakers just ran out of patience for. Whatever she finds out there is its own story, and Game of Thrones is not going to tell it. It just pointed her at the horizon and let her go. There is something I find worth sitting with in all of this, which is the relationship between the mysteries and the ending. The show's ending was divisive. A lot of people found the final season rushed, the character arcs incomplete, the political resolution too quick, the burn of King's Landing too sudden given how Daenerys had been written previously. These are fair criticisms, and I am not going to argue with any of them. But the mysteries, the things we have spent tonight walking through, are almost entirely separable from those criticisms. The Night King's unanswered nature is not a consequence of bad plotting. It is a consequence of deliberate construction. Varys' voice in the flames is not a dropped thread. It is a thread that was always meant to end where it ended, in the fire, without a name attached to it. The irregular seasons are not an oversight. They are a feature of a world with roughly 12,000 years of history behind 8 seasons of television, and which therefore contains more than 8 seasons can explain. The best parts of Game of Thrones, the world building, the mythology, the specific gravity that the story's consequences carry, remain exactly what they were, regardless of how you feel about Season 8. Westeros is still there. The questions are still open. The weirwood faces are still watching. That is, in its own way, enough for tonight. The world continues, as it always does, after the telling stops. The world the show built is still running without requiring an audience. Jon has gone north with the free folk, past the broken edge of Castle Black, into a forest nobody has bothered to map. Somewhere in the north, Sansa is governing with the steady competence you develop after years of being underestimated by everyone who thought they knew better than you. Arya has pushed west on a ship with no settled destination, past the last line of any Westerosi chart into whatever the ocean holds beyond the edge of the known world. Bran sits as King of the Six Kingdoms after being chosen by the Lords of Westeros, presiding over the small council and waiting to see what comes back. And Drogon, last spotted flying east toward Volantis, carrying Daenerys' body, has gone somewhere the show declined to follow. Bran said he would try to find Drogon. The camera did not. None of what we went through tonight has been resolved by the telling. None of it will be on any particular morning. These questions have been sitting in the world since the finale aired in 2019, and in some cases much longer, since Martin first built this place in the early 1990s, since whoever it was in Westeros' deep history made the choices that set the long sequence in motion and left no record of why. Westeros was always going to contain more than any account of it could fully hold. The history goes back too far. The questions reach too deep. A world with 12,000 years of mythology behind it cannot be exhausted by 8 seasons of television, and the show, at its best, understood that a world with visible edges is a smaller world than one whose edges exceed the frame. What the mysteries leave open is part of what keeps Westeros feeling inhabited rather than built. Real places work that way. So does this one. If sleep arrived somewhere along the way, in the middle of the White Walker material, or during the long consideration of what Varys knew and never said, or somewhere in the quiet stretch of Cersei's prophecy, that was always what this was built for. The weirwood trees remember everything, whether anyone is watching or not. The weirwood faces are still watching. The north is still cold. Somewhere beyond the wall, Ghost is probably very comfortable about all of it. Good night.